Good afternoon, welcome. I'll jump right in because we're running a little late. My name is Lauren Gilbert. I'm the Senior Manager for Public Services at the Center for Jewish History, which is the shared home for our 5 partner organizations. And together, collectively, their collections comprise the world's largest and most comprehensive archive of the modern Jewish experience outside of Israel. While our building is currently closed to the public, our staff is still hard at work. And you can continue to search our collections online, receive the assistance of our expert librarians, view our online exhibitions, and attend our online programs like this one. Please check out our upcoming programs at the Center's online calendar at our website, cjh.org. Our next author event will be on Monday, April 26th at 4 p.m. with Michael Schneerson, who is the author of Bugsy Siegel, The Dark Side of the American Dream. But today we'll be talking about The Last Million, Europe's Displaced Persons from World War to Cold War. And this is a well-timed discussion as we are entering into Passover week, and it's a story of liberation and exile. The images you were looking at earlier from the slideshow were all taken from the book, which is really an outstanding book, by the way, quite an achievement, and I highly recommend it. I will put a link to the Amazon page in the chat for purchasing. Of course, purchase from your favorite bookseller, but I will share that link with you. The program is being recorded. It will be available for viewing via the Center's webpage and our YouTube page in just a couple of weeks. So let me introduce our speakers, then I will turn it over to them, and I'll come back at the end to moderate the Q&A. So you'll see that the chat box is closed off, but you can put all your questions in the Q&A as we go along, and we'll get to as many of them as we can at the end. Okay, our interviewer today, Atina Grossman, is Professor of History in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Cooper Union in New York City. She's the author of many publications, including Jews, Germans, and Allies, Close Encounters in Occupied Germany, which won the George L. Moss Prize in 2007 from the American Historical Association. She received her PhD in history from Rutgers University. Our author today, David Nasaw, is also the author of The Patriarch, selected by the New York Times as one of the 10 best books of the year and a 2013 Pulitzer Prize finalist in biography. Andrew Carnegie, a New York Times notable book of the year, the recipient of the New York Historical Society's American History Book Prize, and a 2007 Pulitzer Prize finalist in biography, and The Chief, which was awarded the Bancroft Prize for History and the J. Anthony Lucas Book Prize for Nonfiction. He is past president of the Society of American Historians, and until 2019, he served as the Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. Professor of History at the CUNY Graduate Center. He earned his PhD from Columbia University. Welcome, Atina and David. Thank you for being here, and thank you everyone else for your patience. And I will now turn it over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody, and I'm delighted to be here and to be here again, virtually with David Nasaw, to sort of, in a sense, following up on a conversation about this really extraordinarily comprehensive and empathetic and deeply, deeply researched book, which we had actually quite a few months ago at a different moment in our national history and in the history of the pandemic. I'm actually, in one sense, I'm glad that we had this little delay because it gave you more time, perhaps, to look at the photos that were flashing on your screen. And in a way, I wish we had the time, which we don't, to go through every single photo, because each one of those photographs tells a story that we could well go into more. But we have not that much time. I think we were planning on about 40 minutes of conversation and then 15 minutes of Q&A. Lauren will let us know if we should cut that a little shorter. I realize it's past it. People are also getting into Passover mode, many of you. And I'll just start off by asking a question that is both about the book and also about what David has learned in the multiple months now of his virtual book tour. And that really has to do with thinking about the kind of misunderstandings or surprises that he discovered for himself while he was writing it, about misunderstandings that his actors had at the time, and also maybe some of the sort of misunderstandings and surprises that you've encountered while you were talking to so many people in the last few months, alas, virtually, but you reached more of them. And perhaps we could start really with the moment that Lauren already invoked when she talked about the link between Passover, stories of liberation, and perhaps a much more complicated story and a much more fraught story, and that you discovered for yourself and for your subjects, and also among your audiences.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And again, my heartfelt apologies for the delay. Blame it on Zoom and my inability to maneuver my way through Zoom. I am a US historian. I'm an American Jew. And I had all my life labored, worked, lived under the misperception that although the United States of America, the Congress, the White House, President Roosevelt did little, if nothing, to save the European Jews during the war, I somehow assumed that when the war was over and the camps were liberated, the United States and the nations of the world had opened their gates, their hearts, to the Jewish survivors. I know the children of survivors. I know a few survivors myself. And in doing my research for another book on Joseph P. Kennedy, a very different individual, I began to realize and to come into contact with memoirs, with individuals who were survivors or the children of survivors. And I realized that the survivors did not come to this country, the United States of America, until 1949, 1950, 1951. So my task was set. What happened? Where were they for those 4 years? What did liberation mean for the Jewish survivors of the Shoah? And I learned, to my dismay, my disgust, my horror, that the nations of the world refused to open their doors. That the survivors spent 3 to 5 years in displaced persons camps in Germany, for the most part, some in Austria, some in Italy, because nowhere on earth were they welcomed. They were part of the population that I refer to, that was referred to, from which I take my title, the last million. The last million refugees who were left in Germany when the war was over, because they had no homes to return to like the Jews, because they were wary about returning to a country that had been devastated and was now dominated by the Soviets like Poland, or they were afraid of returning to Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, and the Ukraine, because they had, in large ways and small, collaborated with the Nazi occupation and were worried about retribution if they returned. So I set myself on my own journey to understand what liberation meant. It was not a pleasant journey. I learned a great deal and have continued to learn a great deal. To answer the second part of Attina's wonderful question, in the months that I have done these Zoom interviews, these Zoom events, I have received literally dozens of letters, of emails, of phone calls from individuals who identify themselves as the children of displaced persons and who have thanked me because their parents, having survived the Shoah and then spent 3 to 5 years in displaced persons camps, never told the children about their experience. The children, many of whom had been born in DP camps, thanked me for explaining to them what had happened, filling in a piece of their family's history. At 1 o'clock today, I spoke to a man named Morton Dembow, a St. Louis attorney, and his brother Izzy. They were born in a displaced persons camp in Munich and never understood, because their parents wouldn't talk about it, how their parents got there and why and how they survived until 1949 when they left.
I mean, David, one of the sort of wonderful aspects of having a distinguished American historian write this book, and then hearing about the responses that you've received, is that, for those of us who've kind of been toiling in this material for many years, it seems still surprising that it remains in so many ways an untold story. It seems that one can publish as many academic articles and have academic conferences and publish books, and yet this in-between period and the nature of who these survivors actually were in the DP camps still has not been fully integrated, and so it's I think it's very useful actually for those of us for whom this does seem in some ways to be a familiar story, and that is probably true for some of our audience, and maybe not for another, to be reminded, and also to get the perspective from the side of U.S. archives and the U.S. public. So my second question, which kind of actually connects to your point about how was it that the people you knew who were DPs seem to have arrived not in 1945 or 1946 or even 1948, but not really for the most part until the early 1950s, and even then in relatively smaller numbers than non-Jewish DPs, actually in much smaller numbers. And your numbers are, I've been learning from your numbers. And so I wanted to turn to another point that remains deeply researched, but still marginalized and still a surprise to many people. And I have to say that as much as I knew about DPs, when I started writing a book about them, already quite a few years ago, this fact came as a surprise to me when I did my research, and to my chagrin, that I didn't know this. And that has to do with the question of, when you talk about who are the survivors, who are these, for now, we'll get to the larger context of the many, many non-Jewish survivors, I think in the next question. But the Jewish survivors that you're talking about, the ones who Earl Harrison saw, were one set of people who you've already identified, because he saw them in the summer of 1945. But by the summer of 1946, or certainly by the fall, the vast majority of survivors were not the people that Earl Harrison saw and the ones that he went to Truman so outraged about, or whose conditions he was so outraged about. And I wonder if you could talk about where the majority of these DPs actually had spent the war, and what the nature of their experience was, because that's something that you do integrate into your book in a way that is not always so well integrated.
When the Germans surrendered in May of 1945, and the Buchenwald and Dachau and Ohrdruf and the German camps were opened, or the concentration, death, and labor camps in Germany were opened by the Allied troops, they discovered that a small percentage, or we now know that only a small percentage of the residents of those camps who were liberated were Jewish. And why? Why? Because they had been murdered.
Exactly.
They'd been murdered. And in 1944, when the Germans recognized that, for two reasons. One, because there had been 3 or 4 rebellions of the Jews in the camps, against their guards. And 2, because the Germans did not want the world to know what they had done. They raise the camps. They dig up the corpses. They bury the corpses. They try to destroy any and all evidence. They take the survivors, put them into trucks, put them onto trains, death march them back to Germany to work them to death. Of the survivors who come out of the camps in 1944, 1/3 to 1/2 die on the way. When they are put to hard labor, 1/3 to 1/2 die in the months that they are in. Maybe it's closer to 1/2, die in the months that they're working underground in German armaments plants, in mines, underground. They're worked to death. When the camps are opened, another more than 10,000 Jewish survivors die of malnutrition, of typhus, because they're fed by the Allies and their bodies can't take the food, and they die. We don't know how many Jews come out of the camps. Maybe, what are your figures? 30, 40,000 of my figures.
Of survivors?
Yeah.
Well, the early figures that we usually used were somewhere around 50,000.
Yeah.
Yeah, as you know, it's very hard to come up with exact numbers, and also to distinguish between people who were still alive when they were liberated. And as you already pointed out, liberation is a very relative concept at
Right.
the time and later, and those who died in the immediate aftermath. The sort of most famous example being the story of Belsen and the British, actually not liberation, but accepting the handover by the British of the camp. But let's say around 50,000 at most.
It's 50,000 top, come out. Now, many of those, the first thing they do when they get out of the camps, if they can walk, if they have any strength whatsoever, large numbers of them try to get back to their hometowns in Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia to see if anyone is alive. So maybe 25, 30, 40,000 of the survivors end up in the camps. In
the DP camps.
In the DP camps, right. And in the beginning, they are put into camps by nationality. The Allies don't recognize Jews as an entity. What they do instead is that they put together Polish Jews with Polish non-Jews, Latvian Jews with Latvian non-Jews, in many cases in the same camp. We get the tormentors, the prison guards, the Ukrainian prison guards with the surviving Ukrainian Jews. That ends after Truman sends Earl Harrison as his delegate to see what's going on in the camps. And Earl Harrison says, we are treating the Jews exactly as the Germans did. We're putting into camps, we're starving them. The only difference is we're not exterminating them. So the Jews in the summer are put into their own camps. There are maybe 40, 50,000 of them. In 1946, everything changes.
Right.
80 to 90% of the Polish Jews who survive in the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, they cross the river. They cross into the Soviet Union. They do not have an easy time in the Soviet Union. Many are put to hard labor. They are in the Asiatic reaches, thousands of miles from home. When the war is over, Stalin says, I will furnish trains to bring you back to Poland. In 1946, late 1945, mostly in 1946, they come back to Poland. 250,000, 300,000 maybe. We can't get a real sense of these figures. We have to approximate. 200 to 250,000 of those Polish Jews who return to Poland discover that anti-Semitism is worse than it was when they left. That Nazi propaganda had seeped in. More than that, their property, their businesses, their homes, their farms, their apartments have been taken over by Poles who refuse to give them back. And there are stories, countless stories in the literature about Polish Jews returning to their hometowns, to their apartments, businesses, and told you have no place here anymore. The only safe place, the only secure place, and this is an irony, a tragic irony of history, the only secure place for the Polish Jews who had survived the war and come back to Poland was in Germany, in displaced persons camps, sometimes behind barbed wire, guarded by the American military. So by mid-1946, that 40 to 50,000 Jewish survivors in the camps becomes 200 to 250,000. Now, the question is, are they survivors? Yes, as far as I'm concerned, they're survivors of the Shoah, of the Holocaust. The vast majority of survivors did not come out of Auschwitz. They did not come out of the camps. They came out of hiding. They came out of the Soviet Union. They came out of the forests, the barns, the partisan units in Poland. And they too are survivors. I had an email from someone who said, my parents hid out in Poland during the war. I've always thought of them, are they survivors? And I said, yes, they're survivors. So by mid-1946, there are 200 to 250,000 Jewish survivors in the camps, most of them in Germany, some in Austria, some in Italy, including Jared Kushner's grandfather.
Well, actually, now you've surprised me with your estimate of 80 to 90% of all surviving Polish Jews were in the Soviet Union. I think that, you know, there too, it's very hard to get any kind of exact figure.
What do you think?
Well, I think those of us who've been working with this history tend to think about, you know, so 3/4 to 80%.
Yeah.
It depends on whose figures you're looking at, whether it's the figures that we really need to look at more carefully, and it's very hard to get to them because a lot of this material is still in KGB archives, is the, you know, repatriation numbers from the Soviet Union. But in any case, it was clearly the majority of Jewish DPs. And there is this, as you say, this dramatic change after, and there's an image of that was on the slideshow, in particular after the infamous pogrom in July of 1946 in Poland. So the question that comes up over and over again, and we just talked about this actually not very long ago at a different conversation at the Center for Jewish History between Deborah Dwork and Eliana Adler, who's written, you know, an excellent new book called Survival on the Margins about the experiences of Polish Jews, is that this remains a story that is extremely difficult to integrate into the history of the Holocaust, even though these are the great majority of survivors. And I wanted to just, you know, sort of push a little on that again from your perspective about you know, why you think that is. I mean, again, you know, we have many answers, but I was so struck, and I don't want to take your punchline, but I'm going to. I was so struck in our a phone conversation we had when we were discussing this event, when you pointed out that there was certainly one group of people to whom this was hardly unknown and not at all marginal to their decision making about, again, the immigration policy and which doors would be open to which DPs in the United States. And so, yeah, I gave you an opening.
Thank you. The end of hostilities, VE Day, is in May of 1945. It is not until June of 1948, more than 3 years later, that Congress passes a Displaced Persons Act. The debate over that act had gone on for about a year and a half. Truman was afraid because he knew the Congress and the Senate, and he knew that in 1946, 1947, after a debilitating loss of seats by the Democrats, that Congress was dominated by Southern Democrats and Midwestern Republicans, neither of them who wanted any immigrants, much less Jews, to come to this country. He delayed even pushing for legislation. The opponents of immigration knew, they did their research, and they knew that the vast majority of Jewish displaced persons had spent a war in the Soviet Union. So number one, the congressmen and senators, and I'm not going to give you names, they're in my book, including, I'll give you one, West Virginia Senator Revercombe. They make the point, one, that the Polish Jews aren't really survivors. They're not really displaced persons. You know, they could have stayed in the Soviet Union. They could have stayed in Poland. They're not displaced persons. They deserve nothing from the world at large, nothing from the Americans. Point number one. Point number two, even if they did deserve some support from the American people shouldn't give it to them. Why? Because they were security risks.
Right.
The American Congress reverberates with the language of the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy. They mouthed words that had come out of the Vatican after the Bolshevik Revolution and that had come out of Nazi literature from Hitler to Goebbels to all the rest, that the Jews had to be exterminated because they were a threat to Western civilization, that all Jews were Bolsheviks and the leadership of the Bolsheviks were Jews. Totally wrong, totally mistaken, no basis in fact, lies, lies, lies. But they were used effectively to keep the Jews out. So that in June of 1948, when legislation is finally passed, allowing the entrance of 200,000 displaced persons, any displaced persons who had entered Germany after December of 1945 is ineligible for a DP visa. That means that 90% of the Jews are ineligible for these visas. That's the only group that's ineligible. And the legislation that bars the entrance of the Jews privileges the entrance of displaced persons whose country has been annexed by another. Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Ukrainians, from which the largest number, the largest percentage of Nazi collaborators steal away from their homes in 1944 and 1945, some with the help of the Wehrmacht, settle in Germany. When Germany loses the war, they disguise their past, enter the DP camps, and are given a free pass into the United States while the Jews are excluded by the Displaced Persons Act of 1948.
You're pointing actually to another irony in a history that is full of ironies, that I mean, the Jews sort of get this experience in the Soviet Union thrown at them from both ends. That is to say, at early on, those Jews who are fleeing Poland are defined, as of course you point out, are defined as infiltrees, yeah. Not, and therefore not eligible for DP status. And in fact, that is a position that the British, for reasons of their own, having to do in part with the justified fear that the DP camps would become incubators for Zionism, actually maintain. And the Americans then become, in a sense, the good guys, because they are eventually opening the doors to the infiltrees. But the original argument, which is also the argument from UNRWA, right, was that, well, and by the Germans for sure, who said, why do we're not responsible for these people. We didn't do anything bad to them. They're victims of communism. Yeah. And if they don't like it, if they don't like it in Poland, well, then they're just economic migrants, right? They're not refugees, and they're certainly not refugees for whom we are responsible. And then, right, so that's sort of the first problem. And then once, the United States becomes the sort of protector and policer of the Jewish DPs in occupied Germany, then they let them into their occupation zone, right? But then they don't let them into the United States because they could be a fifth column.
One of the frightening things that, the British Foreign Office and Ernest Bevin, a true anti-Semite, says over and over and over again, these Jews, and I'm almost paraphrasing now, who do they think they are? Everybody suffered in World War II. Lots of Eastern Europeans lost their homes. What's the big deal?
Right.
Why do they demand to be put at the front of the queue? Let them wait online. And if they continue to do this, they're simply going to raise another bout of anti-Semitism and do their compatriots in Great Britain a great ill. Number one. The other, do you know Joe Berger's book?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. Okay. Go ahead. Take it away.
Joe Berger, the New York Times reporter, journalist, and wrote an extraordinary book.
It was one of the first books I ever read about DP.
Yeah, it's a great book. And when it's time for him to go to college, he knows his parents were raised in DP camps. And he knows his parents were married in DP camps.
Right.
And he's always believed that he was born in the DP camp. And when it gets time to go to City College, City College demands a birth certificate. So he goes to his mother, he's 19, 20. And he says, Mom, where's my birth certificate? And his mother stares at him and says, sit down, Joey. I got a story to tell you. And Joey sits down and his mother says, you weren't born in Poland. You weren't born in the DP camp. We faked your date of birth. You were born in the Soviet Union. And Joey says, Mom, why have you kept this from me for 19 years? Why are you telling me this now? And his mother says, because we were afraid that if you came to the United States with a Soviet passport, and if we admitted that we had been married and had a child in the Soviet Union, we never would have gotten our visas.
Exactly. And I was thinking of exactly that story as, which is not only Joseph Berger's story, but that of many DPs who, in today's parlance, sort of committed immigration fraud, as it were, by simply lying on their applications for entry to the US, because this was part of their strategic survival sort of mode, and then were afraid, often to this day, of telling the story. Of course, for Berger, the other shock was that he was older than he thought he was, right? But this meant, and this of course is not the subject of your book, but is the work that is being done now, and has been so enriched now also by Eliana's book, that the extraordinarily complicated experiences, first in special settlements in the so-called Siberia, Kazakhstan, and then after the summer of 1941, for the most part in Central Asia, that Polish Jews endured during the war, were simply not part of the story, or only a very, very marginalized part.
An extraordinary story.
It's an extraordinary story.
And we're not talking about a couple of people here.
No.
We're talking about hundreds of thousands of Polish Jews who find themselves in Kazakhstan, and make lives, survive. Some of them, making blankets for the Red Army, others in the Red Army, others working, in intolerable conditions. And we know so little about it. I mean, the sources are just, they're there, but they're very difficult to find.
Well, there are. I think there's more and more work being done, and different parts of the story are, being retold more and more often. And we also have many memoirs, which have been encouraged by the children and sometimes now the grandchildren of people who survived in the Soviet Union, and also talking about the many people who did not survive in this, who did not survive, but who died not because they were Jews, but because they were part of terrible wartime conditions in the Soviet Union, including the depredations of the NKVD. So it's such a complicated tale, which we need to tell. And the fact that you are now raising it in a different context, which is, and talking about the impact of ideas about Judeo Bolshevik conspiracy in the US, which of course was part of the reason that those Polish Jews who were repatriated to Poland, as well as the Polish Jews who had managed to survive under Nazi occupation, were pushed to flee, because those same ideas of a Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy and of the Jews as being the carriers of a Stalinist ideology, because ostensibly they were so grateful to Stalin, were part of the history of Poland. I see, yeah.
Oh, let me just say one quick.
Right.
When the Jews, the Jewish DPs begin the illegal Aliyah bet, the British write to the State Department, and they say to the State Department, you have to do everything possible to stop the Aliyah bet. You have to exert pressure on the Italians, on the French, on the Bulgarians. Why? Because the Jews are communists. Right. And the reason why they're going to Israel is that they're being paid to do so by the Soviets, and they're going to be part of a takeover of the Middle East.
Right. And so and to understand this story now, also from the American end, I think is so important. I think that we have been given our 5-minute warning, if I'm correct.
And I think I'd love to have some time for some of the questions that have been coming in.
And I see that there are many. I see 32 already. So
yes,
Laura, please.
Quite a few, and the ones I answered in the chat box are gone. So that's even what's left. There are a lot of questions or comments really from people, as you were saying, David, people reaching out whose parents met in DP camps and they were born in DP camps. So thank you all for sharing your stories. If you have, for those of you with specific questions about your own genealogy and genealogy research, please reach out to our Genealogy Institute at gi@cjh.org, and that will be a good place to start. They can probably put you on the right path. Again, that's GI.
If you can put my email address somewhere.
Absolutely.
So
in the chat?
who have any questions that you want to ask me.
Right. I will put it in the chat, but you want to just say it out loud for them right now?
It's DNASAW@GC, for Graduate Center, .cuny.edu.
Okay, I will put it in the box, but it's Nasaw, DNASAW@gc.cuny.edu.
Correct.
So here are some more specific questions. One about whether the Russians ran any DP camps within what became East Germany.
Yeah, no.
Right.
No, the Soviets did not believe that there was that there are only two categories of stateless displaced persons. The Jews, they accepted that, and Spanish Republicans. Everybody else, they said, they are either too damn lazy, they want to be fed by the Americans, or they're collaborators, they're criminals, they don't want to go home because they're going to be met by justice, brought to justice.
And you touched on this a little bit, but there's a question, how did the US prioritize which Jewish survivors they allowed into the US?
It's a great question. First of all, most of the Jewish survivors who came into the US came in with forged papers because they hadn't been in the camps, they were ineligible. So like Joe Berger's family, parents, they had to forge their papers to say that they had been in the camps before December 1945. In the end of the 200 to 250,000 displaced persons, only 55,000, that's the number, best number I can come up with, only 55,000 Jews come into this country as DPs. Others will later come from Israel and other nations, but only 55,000 come in as DPs.
David, could you just say something about the Truman directive? Because that was another distinction in terms of which Jews were prioritized when.
In December of 1945, when Truman recognizes that he's not going to get the British to open up Palestine, he passes as an executive order the Truman directive to let in displaced persons. But he does it in such a way that it has to follow the quotas. So no Poles, no Lithuanians, no Eastern Europeans get in. But those Jews who can claim that they're either Austrian or German citizens get into the country. Again, not a great number of them.
Right, and more immigration fraud.
And there's a question about whether the Jews in the DP camps were pro-Zionist and how many ended up in Israel.
Great question. Again, it's hard to tell from the figures, but I think more than 150,000 go to Israel. Whenever there's a questionnaire given to the Jews in the DP camps, 95% say they're Zionists and want to go to Israel. We will never know how many want to go to Israel because they can't get into the United States or Canada or Australia, and how many are true Zionists. The spirit in the camps, the leadership in the camps, after 1946, when the Bund is sort of marginalized, is pro-Zionist. And large numbers of Zionists go, but I think larger numbers of DPs who want to get out of Germany. And if this is the only way, the only place, that's where they're going.
And even if that questionnaire, I think most of us think that what it reflects is not whether or not people actually want to go, but that almost unanimously Jews have decided that there is a need for a national homeland where they can be, as they think, safe and amongst themselves. I mean, they're obviously not thinking about the actual conditions on the ground in Palestine, but that is a truly dominant position, whether or not they actually want to go or go. I think that's really important to keep in mind.
Another question about the establishment of the State of Israel, whether the Western Allies supported that idea mainly as a diversion or an alternative, so the Allies would not have to accept large numbers of refugee Jews.
Yes, sounds like someone who's read my book. I take issue with most of the standard interpretations of why Truman supports the State of Israel and recognizes the State of Israel minutes after Ben-Gurion after the Declaration of Independence has been proclaimed. I don't think Truman does it primarily because he's a humanitarian or a Zionist or a philo-Semite or has friends in Kansas City who were Jews or read the Bible. These are all explanations given. He does it because he's got to get the Jews out of Germany before a federal republic can be established. And the only way he cannot allow Americans to support refugee camps with 250,000 Jews indefinitely, the only place to get them out is Israel. So he supports the establishment of the State of Israel.
This is a lovely question. How can we use these poignant and meaningful stories to help lessen the suffering of the millions of displaced persons and refugees in camps today, 70 years later?
I think the first thing we can do is build an immigration policy and a refugee policy that's based on fact, not fiction. The Jews weren't communists. The Muslims aren't terrorists. the people coming from the southern border aren't, drug dealers or economic refugees who are only coming to the United States to get rich. One, build it on fact. And two, the American people have a humanitarian streak. Thank God. Congress deals in geopolitical issues, and somehow the American people have to make known to their elected representatives that America can be, needs to be, and should be a place of refuge for those who need refuge, for the innocent refugees and displaced persons who have no place else to go and can't return home.
There were a few questions about the books you mentioned. I just looked up the Joseph Berger title, Displaced Persons,
Yes,
Growing Up American After the Holocaust.
Yes.
So if you're looking for that, Joseph Berger, the book is called Displaced Persons. And Eliana's book, which I think somebody else posted, can you repeat the title of that again, Atina?
Survival on the margins.
Okay, Survival on the Margins. Okay, so we're
If I'm
coming up.
doing that. Polish Jewish refugees in the wartime Soviet Union. I mean, there are numerous other books, including one that I actually co-edited called Shelter from the Holocaust, Rethinking Jewish Survival in the Soviet Union.
I did put David's email in the chat. I know someone was asking for that again. Why don't we take one final question? Was it common for Jews in DP camps to marry Allied soldiers in order to be allowed entrance into those countries?
No, not a lot. A bunch of them married UN people to get into the country. A bunch of them married joint people who worked for the joint to get into the country. And there were a surprising number who married Germans.
Yes, that is another hard to research story. But there is actually, as long as we're plugging our colleagues' research, there is work being done, and I think a book forthcoming by Robin Judd from Ohio State, on which talks about marriages between Jewish survivors and Americans, whether they were aid workers or whether they were GIs, and mostly Jewish, not all of them, and the ways in which Jewish survivor women became also war brides. But as you say, David, it was a relatively small group. There's some very well-known examples, including one of the most important chaplains who married a survivor.
There were a couple of more questions and comments about about this program. Yes, it is being recorded, and it will be available on the center's website and YouTube page in a couple of weeks. For all of those of you who registered for this program, we will send you a link to that recording when it's available. So thank you all of you so much for joining us today, and thank you to our panelists. I do encourage you to read the book, and I did put the Amazon link in the chat, as well as David's email address, which he was so kind to share with us. If you enjoyed this program and want to support what we do at the center, please visit cjh.org/donate now. And I appreciate your time, everybody, and thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.